A bell cracks the morning air, and the village pauses like a held breath. Doors open just enough to frame a pair of eyes. Down the lane, officials in travel-stained coats advance at a measured pace. Not a raid, a routine. One man carries a ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Another wears the small brass seal that turns people into paperwork. In the square, boys are lined shoulder to shoulder. A clerk dips his reed in ink, and the first name becomes a number. Age, height, condition. The page drinks it all without opinion. Mothers stand at the edge of the crowd, hands caught between prayer and protest. A father steps forward with a harvest sack, the year's best grain pressed into the cloth as a plea. The seal-bearer does not bargain. He stamps the receipt, not for mercy, but for order. A rooster crows, a child swallows. A line moves. If a child can be reduced to a line item, what else can be priced? Fields without sons, a language without speakers, memory without witnesses. For 14 centuries, offices and orders, edicts, rolls, registers, market rules, taught clerks how to weigh human life the way merchants weigh spice. Not with rage, but with method. Watch the clerk's hand glide. Unmarried, rural, sound of limb. Watch the map pulse, Balkans to the Red Sea to the Sahara. Roots lighting up like veins in a body built to circulate absence. The bell that started this morning will ring again next year. New ink, new names turn numbers. The stakes are more than one village. Families erased leave empty doorways. Empty doorways become silent streets. Silent streets become a language with no one left to sing lullabies. Tonight we follow the paper, not the rumour. Laws, ledgers, decrees and maps will speak, and if they are this calm, we won't be. Here's what we will prove, and exactly how we'll prove it. The story spans from the first Arab conquests in the 7th century through late imperial administrations in the 19th, and even into the legal aftershocks of the 20th. It crosses the Balkans, the Nile Valley, the Red Sea coast, the Sahara corridors, and the Indian Ocean rim. The through line isn't a villain in a mask, it's institutions. Levies written into provincial orders, market rules posted by magistrates, fiscal codes that set rates and rituals, court minutes that logged bodies as property, and palace rosters that tracked status changes the way a warehouse tracks stock. Our lens stays there, offices, edicts, registers, not on broad judgments about modern believers. We will name regimes, date decrees, and keep each practice pinned to place and century. Method first, we work from paper with signatures, levy edicts and muster rolls, tax registers and estate inventories, market ordinances and caravan permits, palace intake lists and embassy letters, traveller accounts that timestamp what officials were already filing in their own archives. We cross them with secondary syntheses by historians who argue over totals and timing. Where numbers are contested, and many are, we'll say so. If estimates range from 2 to 500,000 for a levy across centuries, or from 5 to 8 million for a class of victims processed by a particular system, you will hear the range, the method, and the caveat. The goal is not a single shocking total. It's a map of mechanisms that recurred because they worked for those who wrote the rules. The core claim is simple and heavy. Overlapping state practices formed a machine. Child levies fed elite corps who enforced the next round of collections. Desert and sea routes moved captives toward processing hubs where mortality was priced into profit. Fiscal codes drained households until conversion or confiscation moved land out of a community. Cultural policies, whether administrative language shifts or the repurposing of sacred sites, thinned memory itself. Procurement systems for courts and palaces absorbed women and children under bureaucratic categories that looked sterile on the page and were devastating in life. Each gear turned the next. One guardrail as we begin. When we describe castration, concubinage, or punishment, we will name the office and the rule, but keep the language non-graphic. When we compare this system to Atlantic slavery, we'll note the different purposes, routes, survival patterns, and descendant populations without flattening them into one story. And when we say you weren't taught this, we'll show the curricular counts, the catalogue gaps, and the archive call numbers. The question isn't whether horror existed. Paper proves that. The question is how law and ledger made it normal. The bell in our opening scene wasn't just noise, it was protocol. Across provincial capitals, the levy did not arrive as a rumour, but as a schedule. A chancery clerk copied an order under a specific seal. A courier carried it along a posted road, and a sub-governor read it aloud to notables who understood exactly what selection meant. In towns edging the Balkan foothills during the 15th and 16th centuries, The instructions specified age bands, often early adolescence through late teen years, unmarried status, and a bias toward rural districts where families had fewer patrons to petition for exemptions. Manuals described inspection points with the same cool precision you'd see in a livestock ordinance. Teeth checked for disease, posture for deformity, reflexes for training potential. Not chaos, criteria. If you follow the paper, you follow a pipeline. It begins with a provincial defter, the register that lists villages and dues. Next to the column for grain or coin, an additional mark appears every few years, human levy. Scribes left notes such as exempted only sons or reduced due to prior service, which tells us two things. First, there were rules that could relieve a household in narrow cases. And second, officials tracked relief as carefully as they tracked collection. From village square to way station, boys were counted again and again. At a district centre, a qadi witnessed the handover, not to bless it, but to confirm procedure. Then came isolation. Transport to a training farm or urban barracks where language immersion and religious instruction began on the same day as drill. Inside the records, identity converts into inventory. Baptismal names vanish. New names appear in roll calls that also note height gains, proficiency with arms, and discipline marks. The point was not only to recruit, it was to remake. In imperial rhetoric, this was presented as opportunity, elevation from peasant anonymity into an elite corps. In local diaries and petitions, it appears as subtraction. A father in a hill parish notes that his eldest never finished learning to harness the oxen. A landlord complains that harvest quotas fell the year the levy was heavy. A monk annotates a chronicle with a line the chancery never wrote. There is no word for the sound of a mother when the road bends out of sight. How big was this? The honest answer is a range with reasons. Surviving musters from some decades are rich. Other decades are patchy. When historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of boys passed through the levy across several centuries, they're extrapolating from preserved rolls, provincial totals, and fiscal offsets where coin dues were reduced because people were taken in kind. In some provinces, the levy was annual. In others, it was intermittent, accelerating after wars, easing during famine. The record of a single district can show a year with a handful taken, and, a decade later, a year with nearly every eligible boy listed. The math is often written on the bodies left behind. Parish registers that show dips in marriages 20 years later. Inheritance cases, where lines end because the son who would have inherited was a number in a distant barracks. But it gets worse, is not for effect here, it's description. The system turned back on itself. Those taken as children returned as men in uniform, tasked with keeping the books in balance. In petitions from mountain towns, notables complain that the collectors know every path and hiding place because they once hid there themselves. That is what a machine looks like from the inside. One component forging another that extends the reach of the first. When future levies arrived, a familiar voice explained the rules. That familiarity did not soften the blow, it hardened the process. The bureaucracy documented not only selection but exceptions, and those margins reveal the stress fractures. Some households intentionally disqualified a child. Doctors' notes appear in court records attesting to an injury. The missing finger that made a boy unfit. The damaged eye that removed him from eligibility. A judge warns a father that self-harm to evade the levy carries penalties. In a subsequent entry, the same family pays a fine and keeps the child. We read those lines not to sensationalize, but to show what procedures do to people when the only language that matters is administrative. Walk the paper forward to the training grounds, and you see another layer. Performance reports. A rookie's file includes a year-by-year tally, language proficiency, doctrinal lessons passed, drill scores. A promotion table lists those who will enter the elite corps and those diverted to auxiliary service or administration. In marginal notes, paymasters calculate stipends against rations, uniforms, and arrears. The language is so routine you could mistake it for a warehouse ledger. That is the point. When lives are absorbed into columns and rows, the clerks can do their work without writing a single adjective. The demographic footprint is measurable. Imagine a valley with 6 villages. In year 1, 30 boys are taken across the valley. 20 years later, parish books record a marked decline in marriages. Wills begin listing collateral heirs, cousins and nephews, because direct lines failed. Field surveys from later centuries note terraces abandoned not after a plague, but during a long, steady period of outflow. The levy does not look like war on a map. It looks like winter on a family tree. branches thin where no axe was swung. Officials understood this, even if they did not say it in public. A provincial governor's circular instructs collectors to avoid taking two brothers from the same household within a set term, a humane-sounding rule that also protected agricultural production. Another decree allows temporary postponement during drought, not out of pity, but because starving provinces fail to pay taxes. In the state's calculus, people were units in multiple columns at once: military potential, fiscal yield, and, when removed from their birthplace, leverage over that very birthplace. The ledgers let us watch the balancing act. There were, of course, voices that praised the system. Court poets described the corps as a meritocratic marvel, bringing disciplined order to the frontier. Some officials from minority communities petitioned for protection by the very troops raised from their children, hoping that service would purchase security. This tension, extraction on one page, patronage on another, shows why the machine persisted. It solved problems created by its own movement. If borderlands rebelled, commanders sent troops who spoke the rebels' language and knew their paths. If notables resisted taxes, administrators reminded them that exemptions and favors for their nephews in service depended on cooperation. The file jacket becomes a leash. In one district register, we meet a child by absence. The valuation column for a farm changes hands twice in a decade. Then the land is noted, attached to the imperial grant. Cross-reference a court case, and we find that the owner died without heirs after his only son entered service. The land passes to a foundation tied to the corps. That bit of paperwork does not crow about conquest. It only updates ownership. Yet it is the quiet sentence that tells a larger story. The levy did not only move boys, it moved land, influence, and memory. Travellers saw the front end, not the fine print. A Venetian agent writes of a February morning when the snow mutes the road and only the official's boots break the crust. He counts 20, taken from 3 hamlets, and notes the local priest's attempt to read a letter of protest. The agent's interest is economic. He wonders whether shortages of young labourers will raise the price of timber exports. But he catches the atmosphere. A ritual, not a riot. That atmosphere matters. Systems that operate by ritual survive longer than systems that operate by panic. What does this tell us about scale? A responsible narration repeats the numbers drum with care. Across several centuries, orders and rolls point to hundreds of thousands entering service through this levy in some empires, with local intensities that rose and fell by decade. If one scholar argues for the lower bound based on surviving ledgers, and another for the upper bound by modelling losses in village records, we will keep both on the table and say why. The lesson is not the exact figure. It is the design that made large figures possible without constant war. A final beat in this chapter. The levy's language taught people how to think about themselves. Boys recorded as sound learn to measure their worth by compliance and performance. Parents learn that a stamped receipt is the end of the argument. Villagers learn that objections must be phrased as procedure. We meet the exemption criteria, rather than as rights. Over time, the vocabulary of survival shrinks to fit the form. That is cultural force without a single sermon. The state teaching a grammar in which lives conjugate as dues. We will step out of the square now and move along the routes those ledgers trace. Ahead lies the desert, the river, and offices that turn survival into a percentage on a page. If the levy converted names into numbers, the next system converted bodies into margins and wrote them down with the same unshaking hand. Follow the ledger to the places where accounts were kept in iron as much as in ink. Along river choke points and inland depots, administrators recorded a different conversion. Not boy to recruit, but person to product class. Registers from certain provincial offices itemized captives as intact or processed, with separate columns for purchase price, handling costs, expected loss, and resale value. The euphemisms were careful: preparation, fitness, admittance, but the margins tell the truth. When a clerk writes losses within acceptable range, he is not speaking about baskets of dates. He is describing human beings who did not survive a procedure that the office treated as routine. The geography of this system sits where authority and opportunity met. River towns that fed imperial capitals, desert edge caravan gates where long-distance trade paused, coastal entrepot that moved stock inland. In such places, legal theory and practice made an accommodation. If a jurisprudential text in one century discouraged certain procedures, a workaround appeared in records. having members of tolerated communities perform them under the eye of officials, or situating the act just beyond a jurisdictional line and declaring the result received, not done. The bureaucracy did not advertise the logic, it simply filed it. An endowment register for a civic hospital lists fees for post-admittance care that correlate with known intervals of recovery. A market ordinance sets inspection rules for admitted personnel, along with penalties for misrepresentation. What the law could not say plainly, the ledgers administered. Here the math speaks louder than any adjective. Before any knife was lifted, mortality stalked the routes. Marches from capture zones to processing hubs culled the weak. Estimates from traveller accounts and later demographic work suggest that a third to nearly half might die on certain legs, depending on season and terrain. Then came the critical hour. Contemporary notes and later reconstructions converge on a brutal statistic. During the procedure itself and in the immediate aftermath, deaths surged to a level that any modern audience would struggle to comprehend. In some centres, the survival rate out of 100 might be a handful. In others, slightly better where care improved. Scholars argue ranges, and we will keep that argument visible. But when you read ledgers that factor post-procedure survivorship at 1 part in 10, you understand the office's expectation. Say it once so it lands. Out of 100 taken through this gate, roughly 10 walked out. Say it again so it stays. 10 in 100 became saleable stock. And one more time, because the ledger repeats it implicitly on every line. 90 in 100 were treated as acceptable loss, because the margin on the survivors covered the dead. How could profits survive such loss? The columns explain. A line item shows purchase at 50 monetary units for an intact adolescent. Another line, for the same captive after admittance, records resale at triple that sum, sometimes more, depending on destination. Add handling costs, bribes, medical attendance, and still the ledger walks back to black because the customers, palaces, high households, temple complexes, and certain administrative bureaus paid a premium for an outcome that conferred status, control, and supposed security. Price lists from markets separated not only by age and skill, but by condition, with inspectors empowered to reject damaged goods. It is chilling to see how the bureaucracy aligned. A court manual sets rules about who may be permitted into women's quarters. A market ordinance explains how to verify the fitness of personnel assigned to those rules. A financial officer books a higher wage ceiling for those positions. And a caravan broker's notebook shows why he gambled through a death rate that would bankrupt any other trade. The system did not need a conspiracy. It needed incentives, and those were written down. In the middle of these numbers, a voice survives. A memoir dictated decades after the fact by a man who rose into a palace post begins with his own march at 14 and his admittance shortly after arrival. He narrates without gore, but with a memory for institutional detail. He recalls the gate where new names were issued, the house charter that described duties and restrictions, the months of healing with strict supervision, and the day he was first assigned to inventory textiles, cloth being easier to count than people. He writes one line that could be the caption for the ledger columns we have been reading. They kept us alive first as proof of their skill, then as proof of our usefulness. In his telling, recovery took a season. His dormitory saw 30 boys in beds that winter and fewer by spring. He does not give a precise ratio. He gives a rhythm. Arrive, submit, survive if you can, report for assignment. Supply chains were designed for this rhythm. Capture ages skewed young, not by accident but by a brutal calculus. Pre-adolescents were fragile on the road. Older teens resisted and healed worse. The middle years were a cruel sweet spot, where bodies were both transportable and moldable. Caravans staged at watering points recorded by name in way station permits. Local brokers moved captives between hands under watch of customs officials who taxed admittance differently from intact. In some routes, notarial stamps appear on receipts, just dot past a provincial boundary, the jurisdictional dodge again, so that the next office downriver or down the road could claim to be regulating outcomes rather than authorizing processes. In others, religious endowments attached to hospitals contributed funds that, on paper, sponsored care for the afflicted and, in practice, subsidized the post-procedure ward that kept valuable survivors from succumbing to infection or shock. Even Mercy had a balance sheet. The people who ran this did not imagine they were villains. The writing suggests they imagined they were professionals. A physician's manual copied for a municipal dispensary includes chapters on bleeding control, cooling fevers, and guarding the spirit of the afflicted. Placed next to a market ordinance that fines sellers for presenting unrecovered persons, it becomes part of an industrial logic. A judge's notebook summarizes a case where a buyer sues a broker for failure to disclose that a purchased person had not fully recovered as certified. The remedy is a partial refund, not a rescission of the structure that made the case. The humanity of individuals flickers in the margins, names, small bequests, a description of a kind attendant, and then disappears back into the category stamped at the top of the page. Scholars contest the total scale of this processing across centuries. Some model from surviving price books, extrapolating annual market volumes at key ports and hubs. Others reconstruct from end-use rosters in palaces and courts, then work backward with plausible replacement rates and average tenure. Still others triangulate from burial grounds near known centers where osteological studies, described without sensational detail, identify cohorts that match the ages and likely paths of those who pass through. We should live with the range and respect it. Even the lowest plausible totals are staggering. The highest are almost ungraspable. What matters for our purpose is the mechanism, office by office, fee by fee. The system learned to profit, despite a mortality curve, that would make any compassionate reader stop breathing for a beat. Return to the drum because the ledger does. Begin with 100 brought to a gate. Lose perhaps 30 to 40 on the road before the gate, depending on the route. Within the walls, lose most of those remaining in the hours and days that followed. Record 10 survivors in the resale column. 10 in 100, 10 in 100, 10 in 100. When a clerk in a distant office budgets next year's intake of admitted personnel at a specific number, he is not thinking about the 90 who will not be entered as assets. He is thinking about the 10 who will. That is how the machine masks its violence, by focusing on what can be counted. Not all centers were equally lethal. In some regions and periods, texts suggest attempts at improving survival, the purchase of better instruments, the training of specialist attendants, even temporary suspension during epidemics to avoid compounding losses. A waqf deed in one city funds longer convalescence. A magistrate rebukes a broker for rushing the sale of a still-fevered youth. A physician notes an innovation borrowed from another tradition. Those notes deserve space because they describe human beings trying to blunt a blade their institutions required them to hold. But even in the most humane configurations, the calculus remained. Survivorship as premium, premium as profit, profit as policy. From the gate, the survivors were distributed into roles codified by manuals. Door wardens, storeroom keepers, attendants, messengers. Some moved into the administrative spine of palaces that connected private life with state ritual. Payroll lists show stipends, clothing allowances, penalties for infractions, rewards for vigilance. On paper, it looks like employment. Off paper, it was a life defined by a condition recorded in the first classification. The best a survivor could hope for was to accrue patronage and be remembered in a will. A few did. And in those rare lines we hear gratitude mixed with a clarity that never fades. The donor's identity is so-and-so, and the scribe adds, almost as if the file cannot forget, of the admitted class. When you put all this beside the levy we have already traced, a pattern emerges. One state machine extracts children to build a core. Another state machine processes captives to build an inner cadre and to police private spaces. The two meet in the same budget cycle and sometimes in the same building. The levy's alumni enforce market rules. The market's products guard the doors behind which edicts are written. A clerk in the treasury can read both series in one afternoon. Dues in boys, dues in bodies altered for fitness. The ledgers rhyme. There is a temptation, standing here, to let revulsion swallow the detail. Resist it because the detail is the indictment. Offices, stamps, fees and forms made this possible. Faith texts debated ethics. Regimes found workarounds. Markets discovered prices. Hospitals learned protocols. Courts normalized disputes. And year by year, the categories held. If the levy taught communities to speak in exemptions, this system taught merchants, magistrates and masters to speak in premiums. When the premium exists, supply will be found. The road ahead shows where they found it. Across deserts and seas, on paths where water cost lives and death had a forecast. Follow the roads that were not meant for wagons, but for feet in chains. From interior capture zones to coast, and from coast back inland, administrators drew lines across deserts and seas and turned them into predictable corridors. On a wall map in a provincial office, you would have seen the routes marked with routine names. The Western Corridor that climbs from a savanna frontier toward an oasis belt, the central trunk that threads salt flats and dry wadis, the Eastern Arc that kisses the Red Sea and funnels to river towns, and the ocean lanes that stitch island markets to continental ports, permits for caravan departure list headcounts, escorts, and scheduled water stops, dry bureaucratic lines that, when read against traveller diaries and later excavations, imply something far wetter: sweat, and too often, death. These were not adventures, they were risk-managed logistics. Along the Trans-Saharan corridors, way stations stood like punctuation marks, oases that decided who lived to be counted at the next checkpoint. Official escorts or licensed private guards collected fees for protection and rationing. Their ledgers break the march into regular legs, but survival was anything but regular. Loss rates varied by route and season. On the Western Line, after a bad winter, reports hint at mortality approaching 4 of 5 before the caravan sighted the first northern markets. On years of good rain, numbers improve. Still, even sympathetic narrators concede that the desert kept a tax of bodies. In the central corridor, sandstorms erased tracks and time. "We reached water 3 days late," a broker notes without drama, then records a smaller tally at the next stop. In the eastern deserts, the ratio looks a little better where wells sit closer, but the heat and terrain punish any caravan that miscalculates. Administration adapts. Permits begin to require proof of water rights at listed wells. Fines appear for unauthorized draws. Even thirst had a paperwork trail. At the coastal edge, the geometry changes. Red Sea lanes and Indian Ocean monsoons sort routes into seasons, northbound with one wind, southbound with another. Port books speak in the language of tonnage and duties. Behind those numbers, inspectors certified cargo fit for transport, a phrase that, when paired with insurance notes from the same period, tells you how insurers priced risk. Crossings could be short and brutal, coast to coast, or long arcs that dropped at island markets before heading across open water. Storms cut into stocks, cramped holds amplified disease. The paperwork of loss appears as shortfall entries, official acknowledgements that the count on arrival did not match the count on departure, with a formula to apportion who paid for the difference. Markets at the route termini forced all these roads into arithmetic. In certain years, a single port recorded annual sales in the tens of thousands, with age and gender skews shifting depending on the tastes of downstream buyers and the outcomes of upriver campaigns. The ledgers do not spell out purpose, but destination rosters and household regulations do. Males of particular ages routed toward hard labor, or if processed, toward administrative interiors. Females toward domestic assignments and court systems that kept careful inventories. Seasonal peaks matched monsoon cycles and tax calendars. When state treasuries emptied after campaigning, privately owned markets surged to fill needs that treasuries could not immediately meet. A merchant's notebook shows prices rising when a caravan limped in small and falling when 3 arrived in a week. Supply and demand, except the supply was people and the demand was institutions. Local brokers moved captives between hands under watch of customs officials who taxed admittance differently from intact. In some routes, notarial stamps appear on receipts, just past a provincial boundary. The jurisdictional dodge again, so that the next office downriver or down the road could claim to be regulating outcomes rather than authorizing processes. In others, religious endowments attached to hospitals contributed funds that, on paper, sponsored care for the afflicted and, in practice, subsidized the post-procedure ward that kept valuable survivors from succumbing to infection or shock. Even mercy had a balance sheet. The people who ran this did not imagine they were villains. The writing suggests they imagined they were professionals. A physician's manual copied for a municipal dispensary includes chapters on bleeding control, cooling fevers, and guarding the spirit of the afflicted, placed next to a market ordinance that fines sellers for presenting unrecovered persons. It becomes part of an industrial logic. A judge's notebook summarizes a case where a buyer sues a broker for failure to disclose that a purchased person had not fully recovered as certified. The remedy is a partial refund, not a rescission of the structure that made the case. The humanity of individuals flickers in the margins. Names, small bequests, a description of a kind attendant, and then disappears back into the category stamped at the top of the page. Scholars contest the total scale of this processing across centuries. Some model from surviving price books, extrapolating annual market volumes at key ports and hubs. Others reconstruct from end-use rosters in palaces and courts, then work backward with plausible replacement rates and average tenure. Still others triangulate from burial grounds near known centers where osteological studies, described without sensational detail, identify cohorts that match the ages and likely paths of those who passed through. We should live with the range and respect it. Even the lowest plausible totals are staggering. The highest are almost ungraspable. What matters for our purpose is the mechanism. Office by office, fee by fee. The system learned to profit despite a mortality curve that would make any compassionate reader stop breathing for a beat. Return to the drum because the ledger does. Begin with 100 brought to a gate, lose perhaps 30 to 40 on the road before the gate, depending on the route. Within the walls, lose most of those remaining in the hours and days that followed. Record 10 survivors in the resale column. 10 in 100, 10 in 100, 10 in 100. When a clerk in a distant office budgets next year's intake of admitted personnel at a specific number, he is not thinking about the 90 who will not be entered as assets. He is thinking about the 10 who will. That is how the machine masks its violence, by focusing on what can be counted. Not all centers were equally lethal. In some regions and periods, texts suggest attempts at improving survival, the purchase of better instruments, the training of specialist attendants, even temporary suspension during epidemics to avoid compounding losses. A waqf deed in one city funds longer convalescence. A magistrate rebukes a broker for rushing the sale of a still-fevered youth. A physician notes an innovation borrowed from another tradition. Those notes deserve space because they describe human beings trying to blunt a blade their institutions required them to hold. But even in the most humane configurations, the calculus remained. Survivorship as premium, premium as profit, profit as policy. From the gate, the survivors were distributed into roles codified by manuals, door wardens, storeroom keepers, attendants, messengers. Some moved into the administrative spine of palaces that connected private life with state ritual. Payroll lists show stipends, clothing allowances, penalties for infractions, rewards for vigilance. On paper, it looks like employment. Off paper, it was a life defined by a condition recorded in the first classification. The best a survivor could hope for was to accrue patronage and be remembered in a will. A few did, and in those rare lines we hear gratitude mixed with a clarity that never fades. The donor's identity is so-and-so, and the scribe adds, almost as if the file cannot forget, of the admitted class. When you put all this beside the levy we have already traced, a pattern emerges. One state machine extracts children to build a core. Another state machine processes captives to build an inner cadre and to police private spaces. The two meet in the same budget cycle and sometimes in the same building. The levy's alumni enforce market rules. The market's products guard the doors behind which edicts are written. A clerk in the treasury can read both series in one afternoon. Dues in boys. Dues in bodies altered for fitness. The ledgers rhyme. There is a temptation, standing here, to let revulsion swallow the detail. Resist it, because the detail is the indictment. Offices, stamps, fees, and forms made this possible. Faith texts debated ethics. Regimes found workarounds. Markets discovered prices. Hospitals learned protocols. Courts normalized disputes. And year by year the categories held. If the levy taught communities to speak in exemptions, this system taught merchants, magistrates, and masters to speak in premiums. When the premium exists, supply will be found. The road ahead shows where they found it. Across deserts and seas, on paths where water cost lives and death had a forecast. Follow the roads that were not meant for wagons, but for feet in chains. From interior capture zones to coast and from coast back inland, administrators drew lines across deserts and seas and turned them into predictable corridors. On a wall map in a provincial office, you would have seen the routes marked with routine names. The western corridor that climbs from a savanna frontier toward an oasis belt, the central trunk that threads salt flats and dry wadis, the eastern arc that kisses the Red Sea and funnels to river towns, and the ocean lanes that stitch island markets to continental ports, permits for caravan departure list headcounts, escorts, and scheduled water stops, dry bureaucratic lines that, when read against traveller diaries and later excavations, imply something far wetter, sweat, and too often, death. These were not adventures. They were risk-managed logistics. Along the Trans-Saharan corridors, way stations stood like punctuation marks, oases that decided who lived to be counted at the next checkpoint. Official escorts or licensed private guards collected fees for protection and rationing. Their ledgers break the march into regular legs, but survival was anything but regular. Loss rates varied by route and season. On the Western Line, after a bad winter, reports hint at mortality approaching 4 of 5 before the caravans sighted the first northern markets. On years of good rain, numbers improve. Still, even sympathetic narrators concede that the desert kept a tax of bodies. In the central corridor, sandstorms erase tracks and time. We reached water 3 days late, a broker notes without drama, then records a smaller tally at the next stop. In the eastern deserts, the ratio looks a little better where wells sit closer, but the heat and terrain punish any caravan that miscalculates. Administration adapts. Permits begin to require proof of water rights at listed wells. Fines appear for unauthorized draws. Even thirst had a paperwork trail. At the coastal edge, the geometry changes. Red Sea lanes and Indian Ocean monsoons sort routes into seasons. Northbound with one wind, southbound with another. Port books speak in the language of tonnage and duties. Behind those numbers, inspectors certified cargo fit for transport. A phrase that, when paired with insurance notes from the same period, tells you how insurers priced risk. Crossings could be short and brutal, coast to coast, or long arcs that dropped at island markets before heading across open water. Storms cut into stocks. Cramped holds amplified disease. The paperwork of loss appears as shortfall entries. Official acknowledgements that the count on arrival did not match the count on departure, with a formula to apportion who paid for the difference. Markets at the route termini forced all these roads into arithmetic. In certain years, a single port recorded annual sales in the tens of thousands, with age and gender skews shifting depending on the tastes of downstream buyers and the outcomes of upriver campaigns. The ledgers do not spell out purpose, but destination rosters and household regulations do. Males of particular ages routed toward hard labor, or, if processed, toward administrative interiors. Females toward domestic assignments and court systems that kept careful inventories. Seasonal peaks matched monsoon cycles and tax calendars. When state treasuries emptied after campaigning, privately owned markets surged to fill needs that treasuries could not immediately meet. A merchant's notebook shows prices rising when a caravan limped in small and falling when 3 arrived in a week. Supply and demand, except the supply was people and the demand was institutions. Across these corridors, some captives resisted, and sometimes resistance scaled into something larger. Chronicles and court records preserve fragments of a vast uprising that convulsed a marshland labor zone in the 9th century. Read without romantic filters, the record is sobering. The uprising lasted not because its leaders held the terrain, salt swamps and canals are a defender's nightmare, but because the logistics of the state sputtered in hostile ground. For years, rebel camps raided supply lines, captured depots, and forced governors to petition central treasuries for emergency funds. The sources we have, court letters, tax remissions to loyal districts, chroniclers' narratives, agree on the scale and the ferocity, but they diverge on numbers, as they do on almost everything in this story. What is clear is the aftermath. Once the rebellion was crushed, the record keepers sanitized and resumed, and the labor wards repopulated as if the swamp itself were a ledger that could be zeroed and re-entered. In the archaeology of that landscape, pits of human remains and worksite debris corroborate a pattern of overwork and underlife. The bones are not an opinion. They are what remains when paper lies or is lost. Archaeology shadows the roots elsewhere too. In the desert, satellite surveys outline old caravan lines like faint scars. Ground teams report scatterings of iron at former waypoints. Shackle remnants, buckles, nails, catalogued and dated, not sensationalized. The neatness of the tags is its own indictment. This object, this depth, this century. Near some wells, burial grounds hold cohorts of young people with signs of dehydration and stress injuries, consistent with extreme marches. Reports keep their language professional as they should. The effect on a reader is anything but neutral. Put those reports next to caravan permits that show peak departures in the same decades, and it becomes impossible to claim that the corridors were merely commerce. They were culling lanes. When you place these systems alongside the Atlantic routes many of us learn first, the contrasts and the grim harmonies both matter. One Atlantic passage lasted roughly 4 centuries. These overland and Indian Ocean corridors operated with regional starts and stops in a span triple that. Estimates for total persons captured and enslaved vary widely, and honest historians mark that variance. Mortality makes comparison difficult too. On transoceanic ships in the Atlantic, death on passage hovered from 1 in 10 to 1 in 6, depending on time and route. Over certain desert legs, and in particular decades here, people carrying state permits wrote down acceptable loss rates that would horrify even hard-hearted accountants. But here is the key qualitative difference that shapes memory. One system, for all its horror, planted multi-generational communities who later demanded monuments and museums. The other was designed, in many destinations, to reduce survivorship, prevent lineage, or absorb survivors so completely that descendants would not remember grandparents' names. That design choice is why so many of these corridors exist today, mostly as paperwork and bone. The road's economics whisper one more hard truth. Guards and brokers were not all marauders or ideologues. Many were townsmen taking a licensed risk for an income in a world where other livelihoods were taxed or blocked. A guard captain's payroll lists men from multiple communities. An overseer's diary complains about late shipments of grain for rations. A desert merchant invests in an extra cistern and charges more for water when the sand runs hot. Evil seldom announces itself in costume. More often, it is a schedule, a job description, an invoice. When revolt erupts, the same men file hazard pay claims, and the state, short of troops, sends letters promising remission of certain taxes if local elites help restore order. The machine secures its own bolts. There is a rhythmic cruelty to the march itself that the sources taken together make plain. At each waypoint, count, ration, discard the too weak. At each checkpoint, stamp, assess, pay the fee for protection you cannot refuse. At each oasis, sell a fraction to fund the next fraction's journey. Read enough permits and you start to see the pattern, even when it's not stated. If 4 in 5 do not reach the northern markets in a dry year, you can predict how many new captives must be pushed onto the southern end to keep the markets supplied. If a monsoon fails and a port's cargo shortfall spikes, you can watch prices shift inland and see brokers divert to desert routes, where the death math is even steeper, but the arrival fees are lower. Systems adapt. Bodies bear the cost. Some officials tried, within their constrained brief, to mitigate. A judge finds a guard for abandoning the stragglers too far from a licensed well. A governor orders that march groups be smaller to reduce loss at bottleneck wells, only to rescind the order when a tax collector points out the increased escort expense. A medical clerk persuades his superior to set aside more dates at a hot season way station for the weakest among the trains, and for a quarter, the station's shortfall notes dip. Then a new clerk takes the post, the practice lapses, and the numbers climb again. Individual acts of conscience rarely survive policy inertia. Rhetorically, the horror lies in the accumulation rather than a single lurid detail. Caravan permits, market books, insurance notes, court cases, water rights, and excavation catalogues together form a chorus that drowns alibis. The paperwork of the march is not a sideshow to the violence. It is the choreography of the violence. It tells you where suffering would predictably spike and who profited anyway. It tells you why certain ages were more valuable and why mortality clustered where it did. It tells you how, on particular routes, expected losses became a line item you could forecast like weather. And it tells you, when a revolt briefly breaks the line, how quickly the file closes, a new one opens, and the tally resumes as though people were numbers that could be made again tomorrow. So when we say 4 in 5 on a bad corridor did not survive the march, understand that this is not a metaphor. It is a bureaucratic expectation embedded in costs, in prices, in shortfall formulas that divvy blame between shipmaster, broker and guard captain. And when we note that market books record tens of thousands sold in a port in a peak year, know that those numbers already exclude the many who died on the road. You are not seeing the crime, you are seeing the survivors of the crime restated as inventory. The rest of the road lies quiet beneath sand and salt and paper. In the quiet of an archive, history breathes in stamps and margins. A clerk's seal sinks into paper with a dull thud. Ink blooms. A number fixes a life. Here, the violence is administrative. A tax register opens to columns ruled with care. Dates in one, names, sometimes, then substitutions like male, 12, able, levy applied, fee remitted. On another shelf, a market ordinance lists inspection hours, weights to be used, penalties for tampering with scales. A provincial circular insists that permits be carried at all times and presented at checkpoints without delay. None of these lines scream. They don't need to. Their calm is the point. Follow a spine to the back flyleaf and catch a professor's penciled note. Rates rise after 10th month. See Decree 24. That little arrow is a rescue rope between ledgers. You pull the decree. The language reads routine. To secure the treasury in a season of strain. And then you find its companion, a court record adjusting head taxes in a neighboring district to maintain parity. Bureaucracy is memory, but it is curated memory. What enters the book survives. What doesn't has to be inferred from the shadows of what remains. A sudden jump in receipts, an apology for shortfalls, the appearance of a new column, loss at transit that had not existed last year. Boxes in a museum basement carry labels that double as eulogies. Shackle fragments, iron, caravan station, depth 60-80 centimeter, 13th, 15th C. A conservator's card adds, almost tenderly, corroded, stabilized with tannins. You hold the metal and see none of the road, yet the catalogue number anchors it in time and place. Even when we cannot show faces, we can show the serials that held them in a system. That is why receipts matter. They are the fingerprints of policies. There is a danger, of course, in mistaking the neatness of files for the neatness of truth. Gaps yawn everywhere. Burned courts, lost quarterlies, missing market books. Permissions to photograph or publish sometimes hinge on politics far removed from the shelves. But across regions and centuries, enough pieces align that patterns emerge. Edicts generating procedures. Procedures generating forms. Forms generating the language that makes extractions sound like order. Read long enough and you hear the soft hum of a machine. Before we move from these paper rooms to the arithmetic that ground families into compliance, a quick favor that doubles as a promise. If you want to follow the thread yourself, the source timeline and route maps are in the description. They match on-screen cards to archive call numbers and traveller passages, so you can see where every claim sits in the record. Bring the documents into your own hands. Let the stamps and margins tell you what they told the people who lived under them. Now to the math, because receipts do not just count sales. In the next breath, they count breath itself. Open the household book the way an assessor would and run the numbers like a man with quotas to meet. A provincial decree in the 11th century speaks in dry nouns. Jizya, kharaj, ushr. Each a fiscal instrument with its own logic, its own form. In some districts, the agricultural land tax, kharaj, is assessed as a fixed share of harvest. In others, it is a cash sum calculated from estimated yields. Head taxes on non-Muslim adult males appear in parallel columns, differentiated by status bands, able-bodied, reduced means, exempt, and by occupational waivers that a qadi must certify. The point is not the vocabulary. It is the arithmetic that follows. Take a typical register model used by scribes to train junior collectors. A farm family brings in 100 units of grain in a good year. The land tax ban for that valley has crept to 7/10 due to flood repairs, an earlier decree says. So 70 units go out on collection day. 30 remain, but no household eats all 30. Seed must be set aside for the next planting. The scribe's marginal example removes 10 units for seed and fodder. 20 feed 8 mouths for 12 months. The numbers are not tragic. They are tight. A short rain, a sick child, a broken plough, and the column of arrears opens under the family's name. When arrears appear, procedure does not shout. It reaches for ritual. In towns from Egypt to the Jazeera in different centuries, payment day becomes a public ceremony, placed where everyone can see. The circulars justify the staging with words like clarity, order, and equity. Men of the taxed class present themselves before a clerk and a verifier. A token gesture marks submission to the fiscal order. A touch, a word, a posture codified in court manuals, followed by a receipt that restores the payer to his routine. Historians debate how often humiliation crossed into cruelty. What survives consistently are the administrative intentions: to make payment visible, to fuse revenue collection with an annual reminder of who stands outside the fiscal favors that conversion confers. In one Damascus register from a later period, the clerk notes in the margin that a young man watched his father's ceremony for the first time. The next page records the young man's conversion petition a season later. with the head tax line blanked and the land tax recalculated under a different rubric. The math buys food this year. The math also buys the family's exit from a community ledger that had held their name for generations. Travel from desk to desk, and the pattern hardens. In Upper Egypt around the mid-10th century, a series of flood failures prompts provincial governors to raise land tax bans temporarily. Temporary becomes the new normal. A farm that once surrendered half now surrenders more than 2/3. The collector's worksheet adds a fee for use of the irrigation canal that a waqf recently assumed, and a surcharge for road repair after spring caravans. A priest records in a parish book that 2 families sought mercy by changing status. The district court confirms both within the year. The governor's year-end summary boasts improved compliance and a smaller arrears column. No one writes down the absences, the lineages that end when a son cannot inherit under the old system because his legal status has changed, or the estates that, absent a qualifying heir, pass by law to a new owner class. Inheritance is policy by other means. A qadi's manual explains dispassionately that interfaith inheritance is restricted. What flows across that barrier are debts, not fields. Within a generation, land shifts silently on the map. Consider 2 villages set a day's ride apart on either side of a provincial boundary in Anatolia centuries later. One sits under a governor who prefers fixed sums, the other under a governor who prefers shares. Year 1. Both communities survive a poor harvest through remissions negotiated by local notables. Year 5. The fixed sum village struggles because sums do not adjust downward with yields. The share village endures because the fraction, though steep, falls with the crop. Year 12. The share village receives a new assessment to match neighbouring districts that lifts the fraction into fixed sum territory by another name. A cluster of households petitions for conversion to enjoy new exemptions. The register does not editorialise. It adjusts. Names move from one column to another. 40 years later, a tax farmer's contract lists fewer non-exempt heads in either place and more land now held under different tenure. Demography follows bookkeeping. Clerks also tallied dignity. Court records in some cities describe payment postures meant to underscore hierarchy. The taxed present the due with signs of humility. The favoured with marks of honour. Manuals specify where the payer stands, who speaks first, whose receipt is read aloud. Procedures vary by city and century, and scholars disagree about where ceremony stops and abuse begins. But the intent is legible in the bureaucratic prose. The state uses theatre to make fiscal categories feel like identities. The theatre is cheap, the consequences are not. When tax bans rise beyond what a field can bear, instruments multiply. A military exemption fee appears for those permitted to avoid service variously defined. A bridge toll and then a gate toll layer onto market access. A maintenance fee attaches to the canal that keeps your field alive. Each is rationalized in separate decrees. Each has its own little receipt. None of them alone starves a household, but they interlock. The collector carries multiple books now, and a house that was barely solvent in a good year falls into arrears in an average one. Provincial summaries begin to show spikes of confiscation. Tools first, then livestock, then fractions of land. Where local elites intercede, some items are redeemed. Where they cannot, assets leave the ledger of one community and enter the ledger of another. The effect is not dramatic on any single page. It is decisive over a decade. Conversion in this math is not only creed, it is a recalculation. A man who moves from one column to another sees his head tax disappear and his land reclassified under a scheme that, in that province and that year, takes a smaller bite. He counts his siblings and children and adjusts the arithmetic of survival. He cannot pass certain properties across the old line. When his parents die, the estate is divided by rules that drain wealth out of the family's past and pour it into a future mapped by different courts. The tax office calls the shift regularization. A parish register calls it loss. A merchant calls it stability because buyers prefer fields cleared of competing claims. Everyone is telling the truth of their office. The paperwork even captures mercy, and mercy has a ledger number. In drought, some governors issue remissions to whole districts, and we have the slips to prove it. The remission does not cancel the structure, it pauses the blade. Other governors convert arrears into long-term obligations that bind a village to a tax farmer for years. A scribe adds a new column, years remaining. The sum is small enough per year to feel survivable, large enough in total to keep the village's future pledged. Ask why tax farmers appear at all, and the answer is, again, arithmetic. Central treasuries prefer predictable cash. A private contractor absorbs the volatility of harvest, squeezes in fat years, subsists in lean, and takes land when squeezing fails. Language keeps the edges dull. Decrees say equity, parity, stability, due proportion. Receipts say in full, accepted, remitted. Court manuals say proper form. Diaries, when they break through, say other things. We sold the plough to meet the measure. He stood this year. Next year, I will stand. In one border district, a clerk notes quietly that the ceremony moved indoors for reasons of public peace. A clue that what was meant as theatre had started to look like a spark. He does not say how it ended. The next ledger shows payment totals close to last year's, which is the outcome that the centre wanted all along. Numbers sharpen memory more than slogans do. When we say a band rose from 45% to 85% in a generation in a particular valley, that claim is only as good as the registers we can show. Where the books survive, you can watch the creep. Repairs here, remissions there, a new office that needs funding, a war in the next province that drains this one, a donor endowing a canal whose upkeep now bills the users. Where the books do not survive, you triangulate. Court cases over seized barley, estate inventories with suspiciously small net yields, traveller complaints about immoderate impositions on market roads. The point is not to inflate figures for effect. It is to follow the money until it explains behaviour that otherwise looks like sudden apostasy or inexplicable collapse. Pull back, and the fiscal picture completes the earlier map. Roots moved bodies. Taxes moved boundaries. A levy takes boys and hollows fields. A tax ban tightens and loosens ties to community. An inheritance rule translates prayer into property. Each of these is an instrument. None needs cruelty to function, though cruelty arrives often enough at the point of contact between form and life. The genius and the horror of a well-run fiscal machine is that it makes desperate choices look voluntary. A receipt in one column buys bread in a month of scarcity and sells a surname out of the parish book a few years later. The state does not need to declare a policy of erasure when arithmetic can do the work more quietly. If there is a single sentence to carry forward from these pages, it is this: in the record, coercion often looks like math, and once that math binds to ritual and law, it does not need to shout to be obeyed. Begin with a building whose stones once anchored a city's calendar. In a treasury inventory, a clerk writes, transferred, sanctuary precinct and attached library to state custody. Revenue reassigned to a new endowment. The verbs are tidy, transferred, reassigned, but the effect is permanent. When an administration repurposes a temple or a monastic complex, it does not only move walls, it relocates memory. Edicts from named governors in named years cite practical reasons: security, taxation, consolidation of worship, and the waqf deeds that follow redirect rents, orchards, and market stalls to different custodians. The administrative record congratulates itself on continuity. An endowed institution remains, serving the public. The cultural record moves differently. A ritual hearth that once kept time for families goes cold. The court that recorded births, marriages, and deaths is replaced by another. The chants that synchronized a neighborhood fall out of use because the calendar itself is no longer recognized by office. Take One River City, where a fire temple had measured seasons for generations. After conquest, the site's income is reclassified in meticulous deeds and rerouted to a congregational mosque. The artisan who trimmed wicks for the sacred flame now tends lamps elsewhere. The guild that processed offerings disbands. The language of the prayers recedes from marketplaces where it once set prices and hours. The change is lawful, signed, sealed, and witnessed. It is also a reprogramming of daily life. Books travel similar routes from preservation to peril. Before disruption, monasteries, shrines, and scholastic houses maintain catalogues, rolls that enumerate commentaries, grammars, histories, astronomical tables, and hymnals. After confiscation orders, purification campaigns, or simple neglect under new priorities, new lists appear, surrender receipts for volumes, tallies of what officials boxed and carried to central depots, and occasional notes of items returned to compliant custodians. In some centuries, scholars smuggle bundles out or copy fragments in haste. In others, they negotiate access to copy a single chapter before a collection is dispersed. Their marginalia mourn in the specific. The section on prosody is now lost. Tables for the 11th cycle survive only by citation. The archaeological record adds the material story. Charred bindings in collapsed rooms, shelf impressions in soot, caches of leaves reused as pasteboard in later bindings. Philologists much later stitch a shadow canon from quotations buried inside polemics and legal manuals. Even conservative reconstructions, careful to flag conjecture, reveal an attrition whose scale cannot be explained by ordinary wear. Language ends more slowly, then all at once. Administrations privilege one tongue for registers, courts, and markets. Scribes switch because petitions filed in the favored language move faster. Merchants switch because contracts written in the favored language are easier to enforce. Parents switch because children who speak that language find apprenticeships. In the first generation, households keep the old vocabulary at supper. In the second, lullabies survive as verses without grammar. In the third, a grandmother hums alone. The last native speaker dies in an ordinary house with no witness except a child who answers in the new tongue. The archives catch the slope of decline. Early decrees allow bilingual filings for the people's convenience. Later circulars require submissions in the language of office to avoid delay. Market ordinances first print dual measures, then drop the older set. Court summaries initially note misunderstanding due to interpretation, then no longer note it at all. The temptation is to call such shifts inevitable, the common pressure of larger states upon smaller traditions. The records make a tighter claim. Specific offices enacted specific changes at specific times. Decrees convert income from named sacred sites to different purposes in named years. Courts limit testamentary language to what their clerks can read. Market ordinances standardize weights and measures in the idiom of dominant trade. These are not abstractions. They are signatures, dates, and seals. Where scholars argue, how many sites, how many books, how fast a language receded, the disputes turn on the patchiness of surviving material and access to it, not on whether the sequence occurred. Stones tell us where function was reassigned. Books tell us which voices fell silent. Ledgers tell us who paid for the silence and who profited by it. None of this requires spectacle to be devastating. A child raised in a district where the old festival days are no longer holidays learns different rhythms of obligation. A mother who cannot file a contract in her first language must rely on a broker to translate her intent, and trust a court that cannot hear her nuance. A parish that once kept its own property sees assets managed by someone else's court and pays fees to request access. The erasures enter as conveniences, reforms, efficiencies. When the shop signs change script, a century of jokes go unshared. When the schoolroom recitation changes, a proverb stops making sense. When a funeral rite is relocated, a neighborhood forgets the path it walked together for generations. So we read the stones, the books, and the ledgers together. Inscriptions document that names were chiseled out and new ones carved under authority of an office. Waqf deeds and court papers record that revenue streams once attached to a monastery, a fire temple, or a parish shifted to different custodians in decades. Grammars, dictionaries, and legal glosses freeze a language at the moment before it tips into liturgy only. Excavation reports describe scorched floors under fallen roofs and the imprint of shelves that once carried thousands of leaves. None of these sources alone can carry the whole argument. Together they map a chronology of cultural removal enacted by forms and fees. The story is not about vengeance. It is about paperwork. And paperwork, when it is diligent, can erase without ever saying the word erase. A knife rests on a kitchen table between a mother and a neighbor, and both pretend it's just for fruit. Outside, hoofbeats gather like thunder toward the village square where officials will inventory the year's youth. The neighbor murmurs through the levies categories, age bands, measurements, exemptions, the way a clerk might whisper a creed. The mother studies her son's unbroken cheek and understands that the decision before her is not about courage. It's about paperwork. If a body can be sorted by a roster, maybe a scar can move a child from one column to another. She is not resisting a soldier. She is haggling with a table of figures. When she lifts the blade, the cut is shallow by design, meant to heal badly enough to be noticed by an inspector who has never learned her son's name. In another house, a father sends a boy to a cousin's mill, because the same regulations that prize rural strength also exclude the married and the maimed. Down the lane, a family produces a letter of illness signed by a priest who will later swear he signed under pressure. Institutions do not punish devotion. They punish categories, and categories are enforced by forms. The officials will bring their sacks of tokens, their measuring cords, their lists. The villagers will bring improvisations that read like footnotes to an edict. Years pass, and the handwriting changes hands. In a coastal city, brokers keep neat notebooks, while palace offices issue receipts for intake. The system that once budgeted for sturdy sons now files procurement orders for girls and young women, routed through port inspectors who initial the margins and stamp the dates. Age bands appear again, not as height lines but as price brackets in correspondence between agents and court stewards. A new impossible choice takes shape. Open the door to a broker and hope for a lenient placement, or disappear inland and risk warrants for harbouring and fines that can swallow a family's plot. This is not a catalogue of suffering. It is a map of coercion. Parents who harmed their children were not inventing cruelty. They were reading policy and choosing among punishments. The paper that created soldiers' bodies also created markets for women's bodies, and both streams flowed through offices with seals, rosters, and invoices. So if a thin cut could reroute a life, what can a stamped order do? Ahead lie the orders themselves, port clearances, brokerage letters, palace memoranda, written in calm administrative diction. The horror isn't the spectacle. It's the grammar that made the spectacle routine. Begin at the waterfront, where movement turns into paperwork. A broker arrives with attestations of origin, an age band, and brief health notes signed by a guild physician. A customs officer copies the bundle into a ledger and stamps it. The record routes to a municipal registrar and then to a palace provisioning bureau. Every desk adds a verb and a seal. Received, inspected, cleared, assigned. The diction stays dry by design, but the chain it describes is human. When monsoon winds favour the Red Sea, intake skews toward the ports on that coast. When caravans are safer than ships, desert stations report higher numbers. Either way, the file moves faster than the people inside it. The supply network is not mysterious. Ports license brokers who post bonds and submit to inspection. Brokers answer to market officers who enforce ordinances on age disclosure, prior ownership, and fees. Inland, escort permits list route segments, water points, and the captain responsible, with expected delivery dates that read like timetables. Where tributary obligations exist, provincial officers inventory persons alongside livestock and textiles, because the office counts everything that can be taxed, transferred, or assigned. The pages look like ordinary commerce because that is how the state prefers to see them, a sequence of numbers that drop neatly into a tax schedule. Age bands and pricing reveal policy as much as taste. Market boards display premiums and discounts by origin, skill, and age, while palace stewards annotate invoices with current preferences for language groups or training potential. Across many decades, two anchors recur in surviving lists and correspondence. First, intake skews toward mid-teens, a band administrators describe as both malleable and durable for service. Second, lots from select regions carry premiums 2 to 3 times the base rate when diplomacy, fashion, or court rumour elevates their perceived value. These ratios drift with politics but repeat often enough to become routine. Preference, written down, hardens into practice. Inside the walls, administration turns confinement into curriculum. The women's quarters sit under a superintendent, with deputies for intake, instruction, discipline, wardrobe, and supplies. Roster books map the building like a timetable. Probationers, attendants in training, senior specialists overseeing textiles, languages, music, and ceremony. A matron clerk calls roll at dawn, noon, and dusk, noting fever, injury, promotion, or sanction in the margin. A court physician initials returns to duty and records convalescence days. The handwriting is steady, the format standardized, the tone relentlessly procedural. Instruction is layered but non-graphic to describe. Literacy and numeracy for household accounts. Etiquette for reception days. Music and poetry for festivals. Needlework for wardrobes. Foreign phrases for diplomatic audiences. Deputies circulate with checklists, grading diction, posture, and adherence to order. Advancement is measurable. Supervised correspondence with patrons, access to gardens, better quarters, occasional stipends, authority over juniors. A few rise to supervisory posts and sign the memoranda that once defined them. Bureaucracy converts people into policy, then elevates a handful to help enforce that policy. Risk appears in minute books as subtraction rather than detail. Disciplinary pages rarely say what a regulation applied entailed. Petitions survive in which guardians protest mistreatment. Stewards report escape attempts. or attendants request transfers away from rivals. Infirmary ledgers spike after intake days and major festivals when schedules compress and injuries rise. Mortality is inferred, not announced. A name fails to move from probation to assignment. A stipend column that marched across months simply stops. A garment allotment for a quarter is issued to the bearer without a personal line. The silence is its own record. Law meets practice at pregnancy, status, and exit. In certain periods, acknowledged mothers receive formal schedules. Continued service until a child reaches a specified age, then licensed to reside outside on an annuity funded by a religious endowment. In other periods, approvals narrow, terms lengthen, eligibility shrinks. Disputes over maintenance, lineage, or inheritance bring palace rules into qadi courts. Clerks prepare case summaries using service rosters, intake registers, and endowment ledgers. Judges issue decrees that the palace then enforces. Where records overlap, court order, roster entry, stipend line. You can watch a rule walk from text into a life. Provenance matters, because markets follow seasons. When winds falter, caravans carry the balance. When roads flood, ships take priority. Inspectors record age distributions at every intake because policy requires it. Across sources, the anchors repeat for retention. Preferred ages cluster in the mid-teens. Coveted origins often price at 2 to 3 times the base rate when court demand surges. Repetition across so many desks is the proof. Preference becomes policy because forms make it simple to repeat yesterday's choice again today. Not every line leads inward. Some lead out through manumission, marriage, or transfer to a religious endowment. Certificates carry seals from court and palace. The register records a change of status and sometimes a new name. A portion of former attendants join merchant households. Others marry artisans. A few return as salaried instructors. Evidence that bureaucracy can transform biography into curriculum and then rehire the graduate to teach the next intake. Even these reliefs sound like accounting, dates, payments, addresses, because the system speaks in entries and receipts. Ranges and caveats belong on the page. Totals processed through major courts vary by century and region because record survival varies. One palace archived meticulously, another dispersed papers during crisis, a third suffered fire. Method therefore matters. Demographers triangulate intake rosters with wardrobe inventories, kitchen accounts, and endowment books to model headcounts and turnover. Where a kitchen book provisions for hundreds, an intake registers high numbers grow plausible. Where wardrobe spending contracts sharply, administrators likely cut staff. The point is not to inflate figures, but to show how institutions leave measurable trails. Set the palace against the wider economy and the picture sharpens. Ports issue clearances to brokers who must show taxes prepaid upstream, sometimes on the same line as timber or ore. Municipal courts adjudicate when a lot arrives short, an invoice misdescribes characteristics, or a caravan leader claims force majeure. Market inspectors fine brokers who circumvent intake age rules. Palace stewards cancel contracts when hidden illnesses surface within a probation window. Even here the anchors persist. Age bands centered on the mid-teens. Price multiples of 2 to 3 for favored origins when court demand peaks. The numbers keep time like a drum. At the beginning of many chains stands a household choosing among punishments the law has arranged. A shallow scar on a cheek is not rebellion, but a tactic to move a child from one price category to another in a roster that values perfection. A hurried marriage to a cousin is not romance but a hedge, because a clause exempts the married from a levy. A bargain with a broker is not consent but calculation. Palace intake may be safer than unregulated sale. These private choices are not private at all. They are the behavioral effects of policy. Read the palace quartermaster's order book beside the port inspector's docket and the judge's register. Together they explain how a market dressed itself in administration and why survivors remember docket numbers, seals, and the deputy who initialed a transfer. Memory adopts the grammar of paperwork when paperwork governs survival. If you want to see the structure clearly, look where the verbs pile up. Received, inspected, cleared, assigned, trained, advanced, sanctioned, petitioned, adjudicated, released. The list is not literature. It is a life, conjugated by offices. Open an old university catalogue and you'll see the pattern at a glance. Courses on the Atlantic routes cluster into required tracks, with museum partnerships and abundant readers. The eastern corridors, levies, caravan permits, palace procurement, fiscal codes appear, if at all, as a week inside a larger survey, or as an elective that vanishes when enrollment dips. That isn't proof the archives are empty. It's how incentives curate memory. Endowments, visiting chairs, and regional studies centers prefer themes that fill auditoriums, attract foundations, and avoid diplomatic email. Syllabi follow funding. Students follow syllabi. What's repeated becomes the story. Editors face similar arithmetic. A film on well-known routes offers predictable licensing and audiences. A film that names specific offices, edicts, and markets across the Eastern networks can be reported responsibly. But it invites extra legal review, advertiser caution, and delicate calls from stakeholders. Risk managers don't ban ideas. They add steps, soften lines, and move projects to later. By the time the notes settle, the most controversial angles are gone. Access compounds the quiet. Excavations that could corroborate caravan mortality or procurement scale often sit behind slow permits. Archives that hold court-minute books and palace rosters must protect fragile paper, embargo-sensitive cases, and pace digitization. Even when scholars secure access, travel windows and budgets are narrow. Delay becomes the respectable cousin of denial. Careers adapt. Some researchers split findings across technical journals, letting tax ledgers speak in demographic tables, while trimming interpretive paragraphs that link those tables to court policy. Others publish micro-histories. One port, one tribunal, one endowment, instead of the panoramic chapter that would draw the sharpest scrutiny. None of that signals weak evidence. It signals a landscape that asks historians to be tacticians. So, hidden rarely means non-existent. It means asymmetrically amplified. One side of the map enjoys museums, curricula, and a century of popular retellings. The other side requires you to follow receipts. Levy rolls, caravan licenses, market ordinances, qadi decrees, palace inventories, endowment books. The corrective is simple and demanding. Ask for offices, dates, rates, and documents. Reward institutions that publish catalogues. Recognize ranges where records are partial. And refuse the false comfort of silence as absence. The sources are there. The question is whether we will read what the clerks wrote. Imagine the record books pinned side by side on a long table. Levy edicts, caravan permits, market ordinances, hospital endowments, palace rosters, tax registers, court decrees. Read them in sequence and a loop appears that no single document confesses but all of them, together. A child levy order drains one district of its future farmers and scribes. The absence of those sons lowers next year's yields. Reduced yields trigger higher fiscal pressure to meet quotas. Pressure breeds raids into a neighboring province where captives replace missing labor with coerced labor. Caravan permits and escorts move the captives toward ports or processing centers. Market ordinances translate bodies into premiums and discounts. Infirmary ledgers swell during intake months. Palace rosters absorb a portion under rules that prize youth and certain origins. Tax registers, meanwhile, recalibrate assessments as properties change hands under inheritance and conversion law. The same signatures that open a levy also close an estate. This is what a system looks like when it wears many faces. A military bureau writes the first chapter, municipal guards the second, merchants the third, physicians the fourth, palace stewards the fifth, judges and taxmen the sixth. None of these offices claims authorship of the whole, yet their parallel obedience produces a machine. Each office answers only the question on its form: age, rate, route, fee, seal, and by answering, supplies the next office with inputs that seem neutral because they arrive stamped and dated. A levy is just a list, a permit, just a license, a roster, just a roll, a tax bill, just arithmetic. Add them together and you have a conveyor. Feedbacks tighten the belt. Depopulation in one zone increases the relative price of labor, which tempts officials to offset shortfalls by widening exemptions for conversions, temporarily easing a village's famine while ensuring its land exits the lineage at the next death duty. Captives extracted from the margin make nearby communities more brittle, so caravans find new pools of the young and the poor with each season. Processed survivors fetch premiums that finance further enforcement. Palace demand rises when court fashion rises. Brokers respond by pushing supplies sooner, younger, farther. Every solved shortage creates the next shortage somewhere else. Where historians disagree, it is often about amplitude, not wiring. Headcounts vary because archives survive unevenly, because a fire in one city erases a decade of market books, because a ministry in another city catalogued its papers obsessively. Mechanism, however, is legible. Lists feed licenses feed prices Prices feed rosters, rosters feed taxes, taxes feed lists again. You can watch the loop across centuries as wording changes but workflows persist. If you want a picture to hold in memory, picture a wheel with 8 spokes. Levy, raid, trade, processing, palace procurement, fiscal extraction, cultural deletion, and back to levy. At each spoke a clerk holds a pen. The clerk is not a villain in a play. The clerk is a function in a chain. That is how a system survives rulers, fashions, and even reforms. By distributing responsibility until the sum of small obediences becomes a large inevitability. Lay the records end to end, and the pattern stops being a pile of facts and starts behaving like a machine. A levy order in one province removes a year of boys from its fields and workshops. Next harvest falls short. Tax collectors raise assessments to keep the treasury whole. Petitions fail. Raiding parties in the borderlands expand their sweeps to refill labour and meet quotas. Caravan licenses multiply. Market ordinances update fee schedules. Infirmary books show a spike in admissions after intake days. Palace rosters lengthen. Endowment ledgers, budget stipends for new retainers. Qadi courts adjudicate disputes that follow each transfer. Death duties and heirship rules move property out of families that lacked a surviving, recognised heir. By the time the cycle returns to the levy office, the village it names has fewer hands, less seed corn, and more reason to comply. Put that flow into a loop, and each node feeds the next. Levies and raids create supply. Trade and processing translate people into priced categories. Court procurement stabilizes elite demand. Fiscal extraction shifts land and capital away from communities under pressure. Cultural deletion. Closing a school, converting a site, changing the administrative language, reduces the local capacity to resist or even to record what happened. The loop tightens because every solution at one node creates scarcity elsewhere. Lose young farmers and you raise grain prices. Raise grain prices and you intensify tax arrears. Intensify arrears and you widen the pool of the desperate. Widen that pool and brokers find easier purchase next season. There are dampers and accelerants. Good rains or a generous amnesty can loosen the belt for a year. Drought, border war, or court fashion can tighten it overnight. Palace fashion is not trivial in this diagram. When stewards mark premiums for particular origins, brokers shift routes and raids to match, transforming taste into geography. Likewise, a legal tweak, an exemption for the married, a higher jizya band for artisans, a narrower inheritance right across confessional lines, reallocates risk. Households respond with tactics that the machine then learns to anticipate. Hurried marriages before inspections, strategic scarring to move a child into an imperfect category less likely to be selected, negotiated transfers to regulated courts instead of unregulated sale. Policy writes behaviour. Behaviour prompts policy. Where scholars disagree is scale, not wiring. Totals vary because archives burn, because ministries kept different standards, because some cities audited while others trusted the counts they were given. But the causal chain appears in paperwork, the way a river appears in silt. Levies feed licenses. Licenses feed ledgers. Ledgers feed rosters. Rosters feed taxes. Taxes feed levies again. Read one node and you risk mistaking a form for a whole. Read all 8 and you see how responsibility is distributed so finely that no single office admits to outcome, while the aggregate outcome remains brutally consistent. If you want to imagine it in one image, picture a wheel on a road of generations. The spokes are officers. The rim is law. The axle is revenue. It rolls because clerks keep signing. It stops only when signatures change. Picture an ordinary week. School drop-offs, bills auto-paid, a lease in your name, an ID in your pocket. Now remove the assumptions baked into those conveniences. Your child's school functions because law forbids taking children. Your paycheck buys food because the tax code isn't calibrated to starve you into a decision. Your surname persists because inheritance doesn't exclude you for your confession. Once you learn to read ledgers, you see how much of daily life is protected by paperwork with teeth. Rights are not vibes. They're forms, rates, and signatures that stop other signatures. This lens also reframes blame. What we've traced are historical regimes, offices, edicts, rate bans, roster rules, specific institutions in specific centuries, not an indictment of people alive now who share a label or faith. Follow administrative verbs, levied, licensed, inspected, assessed, assigned. until they land on outcomes. Outrage without precision becomes noise. Precision becomes guardrails. It reshapes memory too. A ruin isn't just a ruin. It's an account closed. A converted temple is a budget rebalanced. A language that falls silent is an archive you will never open. When the last native speaker dies, jokes and lullabies die with them, and tomorrow's textbooks quietly lose a chapter they can't write. That is what policy, applied across lifetimes, can do. Reshelve entire cultures until no one is left to check them out. So what do we do with that knowledge? Practice source literacy. When you hear sweeping claims, ask for offices, dates, documents. Was there a levy edict, a court minute, a market ordinance, a tax schedule with bans and exemptions? If yes, proceed on paper. If no, name it a legend, not a ledger. Refuse the shortcut that silence equals innocence. Archives fail for mold, fire, war, but machines leave traces in multiple offices at once. Reconstruct the motion and adjust empathy. Households in these records weren't naive. They were navigating incentives that punished virtue and rewarded compliance. Before judging a hurried marriage, a strategic scar, a negotiated transfer, pause. You're looking at policy reflected back. Our task is to keep that mirror polished, so we spot systems early, rather than let it fog and pay the same price again. Here's what survives the audit. First, laws matter more than slogans. When a levy edict names ages and intervals, when a market ordinance prices intact versus processed, when a tax schedule sets bans and exemptions, those lines on paper become lives in motion. Second, markets remember what conscience forgets. Ledgers, receipts, and rosters preserve quantities, routes, and premiums long after eyewitnesses are gone. Third, math exposes coercion. Household arithmetic. 100 units harvested, 70 seized, 20 left after seed. Explains conversion and flight better than any sermon. Fourth, archives exist. From court minutes to palace inventories, the paperwork is there, even if scattered. Fifth, systems interlock. Levies feed licenses. Licenses feed ledgers. Ledgers feed rosters. Rosters feed tax. Tax pressures restart the levy. One office rarely admits the outcome, but the sum is consistent. Not everything is settled. Totals vary by century and corridor because ministries kept different standards. Some archives burned, and scholars model survival differently. Regional variance matters. Rates in one province, one reign, or one frontier year can't stand for all. Intent versus effect is debated too. A revenue instrument doesn't need an extermination aim to produce extermination outcomes when applied across generations. So how should you watch claims from any side? Ask for a paper trail with addresses. Was there a named office, a dated decree, a rate band? Are figures given as a range with method or as a single round number with no provenance? Can you point to the ledger, register, or catalogue line that would let a stranger recheck the math? That's your viewer toolkit: offices, dates, rates, and documents, plus honest ranges where the record is partial. If you want to test tonight's claims yourself, the pinned sources pack in the description lists the exact types of records to look for: levy rolls, caravan licenses, market ordinances, qadi decrees, estate inventories, so you can follow the receipts instead of anyone's rhetoric. The ledger from our opening scene is still here. The page is brittle, the ink browned by air and time, but the lines remain sharp. A village name, a date, a list of boys by height, a column for remarks, and an official's mark where a parent's signature should be. The family has gone, the record stayed. That is how institutions outlive the people they index, by keeping the paperwork even when the surnames vanish. You can close the book, but you can't unknow what the columns did. Step back and the map looks quieter now. Borders drawn. Cities renamed, languages overlain, but the pathways we traced haven't disappeared. They've become part of how later regimes imagined revenue, manpower, and order. The stories told in classrooms depend on which documents get taught and which are left in storage. Tonight, you read along with clerks, treasurers, market inspectors, and palace stewards who did not think they were writing history. They believed they were balancing accounts. They were. The accounts were human. If you felt a jolt when a number repeated, 6 out of 100 survive, 70 taken from 100, a language extinguished within a few generations, that was deliberate. Memory grips numbers that return. And when those numbers come from receipts, rosters, tax schedules, and qadi judgments, they anchor the emotion in paper. That's the balance we tried to keep, feeling, held to the document. We end where we began, with a household reduced to a line and a system that made the reduction legal, routine, and profitable. If that unsettles you, it should. Because the inverse is also true. Different paperwork can protect. Different rate bands, different exemptions, different inheritance rules. That's how societies choose preservation over predation. The past is not only a warning, it's a blueprint for guardrails. Before you go, if you want to see the receipts yourself, I've put a source timeline and route maps in the description. Every office, date, and rate band we referenced tonight. Open them, argue with them, add to them. And if you're wondering where this road turns next, the next episode follows a single column inside provincial tax ledgers as it climbs from 45 to 85% in one generation, and shows why families, once tipped past that band, almost never recover. The book is already open. All that's left is to read the line that changes everything. Soft breath. Before we push into the tax math that turns hunger into policy, do something practical. Open the description and grab the source timeline and route maps. It's the paper trail. Levy rolls, caravan licenses, market ordinances, qadi judgments, stacked in order so you can follow every office, date, and rate band without taking my word for any of it. If a number here jolted you, 6 of 100 survive, 70 taken from 100, check the ledgers yourself. Print the map, trace a route with your finger, and watch how a decree in one port echoes 3 provinces away. When claims collide online, documents win. Take the packet, keep it next to you, and use it to mark where the story turns from rumor into record. Then come right back, because the ledger we open next decides who eats and who converts.